When the starting light turned green, Anakin Skywalker jammed the twin thruster bars to the extreme forward position, sending maximum power to the raid on Ulzers. The big rocket engines bucked, roared like a caged beast, then promptly died. The boy froze. All around him, racers shot from the start in a cacophony of sound and a flashing of bright metal. Sand fountained in the wake of their passing, clouding the air in a whirlwind of grit. In seconds, the boy was alone, save for Ben Quadinaro's quadrupod, which sat stalled at the starting line in mirror image of his own. Anakin's mind raced desperately. He'd fed in too much fuel from a dead start. The reworked engines couldn't handle all that power at once if the racer wasn't already moving. He yanked back on the thruster bars, returning them to the neutral position. Ratcheting back the switches to the feeder dump, he cleared the lines, then sealed them anew. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the ignition buttons. The starters cranked over and caught, and the big radon Ulzers roared to life with a booming cough. He fed in fuel more cautiously this time, impatience flooding through him, then slid the thruster bars forward smoothly. The engine shot ahead, dragging the pod and the boy after them, exploding out of the start. Anakin gave chase with single-minded determination, not bothering with anything but the dots in the distance that marked the location of the other racers. He tore across the flats, the whine of the pod's engines growing steadily sharper, the land beneath fading to a wash of heat and light. The course was flat and open in the beginning, and he pushed the thruster bars forward some more. He was accelerating so quickly that everything about him turned swiftly to a sun-drenched blur. Ahead, the first set of rock formations rose up against the horizon. Anakin could see the other pod racers now, bright metal shapes whipping across the flats, engines throwing off fire and smoke. He closed on them quickly, the radon Ulzer screaming. In an open stretch, he knew, there were no other engines that could match them. A flush of white-hot excitement burned through him as he caught the trailing pod racers. He hauled back on the thruster bars as he came up on them, giving himself space to maneuver. He went by two as if they were standing still, angling his way left, then right, threading the needle of space they had left between them. When he was clear, he fed power to the engines anew, and the G-force slammed him back against his padded seat. He caught multi-limbed Gascano next. Easing up to the Troikan's snubbed-nosed pod racer, he got ready to pass. Arch Canyon loomed ahead, and he wanted to be clear of the others when he navigated through the ravine. Maneuvering cautiously, he prepared to overtake on the right, but Gascano saw him and quickly moved to cut him off. Anakin waited, then angled left for another try. Again, Gascano cut him off. Back and forth they slid above the desert floor like a crate dragon chasing a womp rat. A cliff drop off a low mesa appeared as a ragged line on the horizon. Anakin slowed, giving Gascano the impression he was preparing for a drop shift. The wiry pilot, glancing back quickly to make certain where the boy was, held his position until he reached the mesa edge, then took the drop first. The moment he did so, Anakin jammed the thruster bars all the way forward, and his racer accelerated with such speed that it rocketed right over the top of Gascano before the other could do anything to prevent it. The dark crease of the canyon loomed ahead, and Anakin threaded the eye of its needle opening with its seamstress skill, racing into the cool shadows beyond. The radon Ulzers hummed anxiously, the energy binders keeping them in sync, the Steelton cables drawing on the racing pod with just the right amount to give through the wicked turns. Anakin worked the thruster bars with small, precise movements, envisioning the course in his mind. Each twist, each deviation, each rise and drop. Everything was clear and certain to him. Everything was revealed. He shot through the canyon and back out onto the open flats. Ahead, beyond a dozen others, Mahonic and Sebulba fought for the lead. The Dug's distinctive X-shaped engines lifted and rose, maneuvering for position. But Mahonic's slender racer was slowly gliding away. Then Sebulba accelerated and swung violently left, careening toward the other pilot. Mahonic reacted instinctively, swinging left as well, and directly into a massive rock formation. Mahonic disappeared in a huge ball of flame and black smoke. Next, it was Zell Bree challenging, trying to sneak past Sebulba from above, much as Anakin had done with Gasgano, but the Dug sensed his presence and rose to block his passage. Zelbree slid left, drawing alongside, holding fast. Sebulba seemed to lose ground, to give way slightly, but when Zelbree was next to him, the Dug triggered a side vent in his left exhaust. Fire spewed laterally into Zelbree's engine, cutting apart the metal housing as if it were made of flimsy plast. Zelbree tried frantically to move away, but he was too slow. Fuel caught and ignited. The damaged engine exploded, and the remaining engines and its pod flew off into a cliff face and shattered. Without slowing, Sebulba sped away from the wreckage, alone at the head of the pack. In the arena stands and from viewing platforms scattered throughout the course, the crowd watched the progress of the race on handheld view screens as pictures of the racers were transmitted from droid observation holocams. From a monitoring tower, a two-headed announcer who bantered incessantly with himself reported on the leaders. Qui-Gon studied a screen with Padme and Shmi, but there was neither mention nor sight of Anakin. The announcer's twin voices rose and fell in measured cadence, filling the air with their inflection, building in pitch to stir the already frenzied crowd. Qui-Gon stared out into the flats, searching for movement. On his right, Jar Jar bickered with a skinny, sour-faced alien named Phanta, trying to peer over his shoulder, besieging him with questions, trying to make friends in the mistaken belief that because they looked vaguely alike, the Polk would reciprocate his overtures. It wasn't working out. Phanta wanted nothing to do with Jar Jar and kept his back turned to the Gungan, deliberately hiding the screen from view. Jar Jar was growing impatient. Qui-Gon shifted his gaze. In the crew pits, R2-D2, C-3PO, and Kitzer waited in solitary isolation. In a private box somewhat in back of and lower than Jabba's, Watto laughed and joked with his friends. The Toydarian flitted this way and that, catching glimpses of the race on various view screens, rubbing his hands together anxiously. He caught sight of Qui-Gon and gestured rudely, his meaning clear. Below, at the start line, Ben Quadanero still struggled to ignite the engines of his quadrupod. Qui-Gon closed his eyes and blocked everything away, sounds and movements alike, becoming one with the Force, disappearing into its flow, searching for Anakin. He stayed lost within himself as the roar of the crowd lifted anew, and the sound of rocket engines rose out of the distance. At the edge of the horizon, a clump of dark specks hove into view. On the starting line, Ben Quadaneros finally managed to start the engines of his racer, all four bulbous monsters roaring to life, vibrating wildly within their casings. Engines and pod lurched as Quadaneros locked in the thrusters. But in the next instant, the energy binders collapsed under the strain, the connecting cables snapped, and the engines shot off in four separate directions, exploding against stone walls, rock formations, and lone dune banks. The crowd gasped in shock, shielding eyes and covering ears as the pod and Ben Quadaneros collapsed to the racetrack in a useless heap. Almost simultaneously, Sebulba's racer screamed past the arena, shooting under the finish arch, and rocketing off on the start of the second lap. Two other racers followed, their engines roaring loudly as they whipped past, their colorful metal bodies agleam in the midday suns. There was no sign of Anakin. Qui-Gon kept his eyes closed, searching within his consciousness. Beside him, Shmi and Padme exchanged worried glances. Jar Jar still hung on to Phanta, pounding him on the back now in excitement as the other grimaced and tried to move away. Three more racers tore past, the sound of their engines dying into silence as they faded from view. A fourth, Odie Mandrell, turned into the pits, the engines of his pod shaking and smoking as he screeched to a stop. Pit droids rushed to service the racer, swarming over the engines. Odie stood up in the cockpit, a big, squat, reptilian Urkit, arms gesturing. But when the engines ignited anew, DUM-4, a pit droid, was standing at the left intake, and the engine sucked it inside, chewed it up, and spitted out the exhaust in the mangled heap. The crowd went back to their view screens, intent on the race. Then R2-D2, standing with Kitzer and C-3PO at the edge of their station, gave an excited beep. Qui-Gon's eyes snapped open. "Here he comes!" he exclaimed quickly. Anakin Skywalker exploded out of the midday glare, the big radon ulcers howling in fury. Amid the cheers and shouts of his companions in the crowd, Qui-Gon Jinn just smiled. Anakin had begun to overtake the pack. At the beginning of the second lap, Anakin was in 6th place. As the race progressed, he was slowly disappearing into the workings of his racer, becoming one with its engines, feeling the strain and tug on each rivet and screw. Wind whipped by him in a screaming rush, locking him away in its white noise. There was only himself and the machine, all speed and response. It was the way racing affected him, melding his body with the pod and engines until he was part of both. Moment by moment, the symbiosis deepened, joining them, giving him insights and understandings that transcended his senses and knowledge, projecting him past the present and into a place others could not reach. Approaching Arch Canyon, he bore down on the leaders, young face intense. Skimming the flats, he whipped past Aldar Beto and sideslipped Clegg Holfast. To one side, a fast-closing Odie Mandrell banked too hard over a sandy rise and caught his engine in the sand. Odie's racer cartwheeled in a spectacular twisting of engines and pod and exploded apart. Anakin was only 4 racers back from Sebulba and could see the Dug's craft clearly in the distance. Everything happened quickly after that. The racers whipped through Arch Canyon and out the other side in a ragged line, with Anakin narrowing the gap between himself and the others. Tusken Raiders, hiding in the rocks of the cliffs that form the corner of Tusken Turn, got lucky and hit Teemto Pagaliz. Teemto's racer simply exploded and was gone. Anakin flew through the vaporized wreckage in pursuit of the others. He passed Ellen Mack and Haba Ki in a rush. Ahead, Mars Guo was closing on Sebulba, wary of the Dug, keeping down and away, trying to sneak past. Anakin drew nearer to both, leapfrogging sand dunes in a long depression, easing up slowly on Mars Guo. Suddenly, Sebulba reached out of his pod's cockpit and released a ragged bit of metal directly into Mars Guo's left engine intake. Metal clashed violently against metal, and the damaged engine began to spew smoke and fire. Mars tried to hold the machine steady, but the failing engine bucked and lost power, causing the pod to veer sharply into Anakin. The racers collided in a shriek of metal, and a leading edge of Mars Guo's vertical stabilizer snagged the Steelton line to Anakin's left engine and released the binding. Instantly, Anakin's pod began to swing violently at the end of its single remaining line, whipsawing back and forth. The radon ulcers continued to act in concert, locked together by the energy binders, but the racer was out of control. Anakin worked the stabilizer pedals with his feet, fighting to hold the pod steady as it swung like a pendulum. The unhooked line snapped viciously in the wake of the engine's exhaust, threatening to tangle or snag on an outcropping and drag the racer down. Anakin groped along the floor of its cockpit, searching for the magnetic retriever. When he found it, he flicked on the power button and extended the retriever out to the left side, trying to make contact with the loose line. The effort forced him to pull back on the thruster bars to cut power, and he fell behind Sebulba once more. Ellen Mack, Haba Ki, and now Obitoki as well swept by him, giving chase to the Dug. Anakin glanced frantically over his shoulder. The bulk of the pack was closing on him once more. After a dozen tries, he finally focused his concentration sufficiently to snag the loose engine line with the retriever and maneuver it back to its hook. Sweat and grit coated his face, and his jacket sleeve was ripped. Casting down the retriever, he jammed the thruster bars forward once more. Stabilized at the ends of the Steelton lines, the pod held steady now as the radon ulcers bucked, and the racer accelerated after the leaders. Anakin caught Ellen Mack first and slid around him easily. He was closing on Haba Ki when Obitoki tried to pass Sebulba. The Dug waited until his rival had pulled alongside, then used the same tactic he had employed against Zelbree. Opening a small side vent in the left exhaust, he sent a gush of fire into the housing of Obitoki's right engine. Fuel in the lines caught fire and exploded, and Obitoki's racer dived nose first into the desert, sending a wide spray of grit everywhere. Haba Ki flew into it just ahead of Anakin, low and tight to the ground. Momentarily blinded, he swerved the wrong way and caught a piece of one of Obitoki's engines where it jutted from the sand. Engines and pod tangled and crashed in a wild explosion. Anakin followed Habaki into the smoke and grit, blinded as well. A piece of steaming metal flew at him out of the haze, careening off his right engine housing and barely missing his head. But the boy was seeing with more than his eyes, sensing with his mind, calm and steady within himself. He could feel the danger waiting, and he worked the thruster bars smoothly, sliding past the wreckage. Then he was in the clear again and bearing down on Sebulba. He caught the Dug as they screamed past the arena and under the finish arch for the start of the third and final lap. In his mind, Anakin could see Qui-Gon and Jar Jar watching him, Kitster standing in the crew pits, his friend cheering wildly, and R2-D2 and C-3PO, the former beeping, the latter nattering back at him in response. Padme, her beautiful face framed with worry, and his mother, her eyes filled with terror. He could see them all, as if he were standing among them, standing outside himself, watching the race. He blocked their faces away, banished the images from his thoughts, and focused everything on Sebulba. They were speeding out of Arch Canyon when Sebulba decided to put an end to Anakin once and for all. The Dug knew where all the droid observation cams were situated. He knew the angles of placement and how to avoid giving himself away. Swinging his racer close to Anakin's, he opened the side vent on his exhaust and tried to scorch the boy's engine housing as he had done with Zelbree and Obitoki. But Anakin had fallen victim to that particular trick once before and was looking for it this time. He shifted just above the cutting flame and out of reach. When Sebulba tried to follow, Anakin dropped down again, but too far, momentarily losing control. His racer veered from the course right into a line of warning signs, sending them flying in all directions. Desperate to recover, he lifted the nose of his craft skyward, jammed his thruster bars forward, and accelerated. The radon ulcers boomed. His racer gave a frightening lurch, and he leapfrogged right over Sebulba to take the lead. Down through the first set of caves and past Tusken Turn, the racers tore, Anakin leading, Sebulba right on his tail. At speeds too great for maintaining proper control, the antagonists banked and angled as if safety were of no importance at all, and finally burst into the clear once more. Again, Sebulba tried to regain the lead, pushing for an opening. Anakin held him off. But then one of the horizontal stabilizers on the left engine began to shudder violently. A momentary vision of Sebulba hammering on his stabilizer just before the start of the race flashed through Anakin's mind. He eased off on the thruster bars, jettisoned the stabilizer, and switched to an auxiliary mount. In the process, he was forced to give way. Sebulba raced past him to take command of the lead once more. Time and space were running out on Anakin Skywalker. He shoved the thruster bars forward and went after the Dug. Sebulba saw him coming and fishtailed his pod back and forth in front of the boy to keep him from passing. Over the courseway they sped, jockeying for position. Anakin tried everything he knew, but Sebulba was a seasoned veteran and was able to counter each attempt. Metadrop flew past as the racers roared out of the dune hills and onto the final stretch of flats. Finally, Anakin shifted left, then right. But this time when Sebulba moved to block him, Anakin faked a third shift, drawing the Dug left again. The instant Sebulba began his blocking move, Anakin jerked his racer hard to the right and nosed in beside the Dug. Down the flat, open final stretch of the course the pod racers tore, side by side, the arena stands and warding statuary beginning to take shape ahead. Sebulba screamed in frustration and deliberately swerved his pod into Anakin's. Infuriated by the boy's dogged persistence, he slammed into him, once, twice. But on the third strike, their steering rods caught, locking them together. Anakin fought with his controls, trying to break free, but the pods were hooked fast. Sebulba laughed, jamming his racer against the boys in an effort to force him into the ground. Anakin whipped the thruster bars forward and back, trying to disengage from the tangle. The radon ulcers strained with the effort, and the steering rods groaned and bent. Finally, Anakin's rod broke completely, snapping off both the armature and the main horizontal stabilizer. The boy's pod jerked and spun at the ends of the Stilton cables, shimmying with such force that Anakin would have been thrown from the pod if he had not been strapped down. But it was much worse for Sebulba. When Anakin's steering arm snapped, The Doug's pod shot forward as it catapulted, collapsing the tow lines, sending the engine screaming out of control. One engine slammed into a piece of the ancient statuary and disintegrated in flames. Then the second went, ramming into the sand and exploding in a massive fireball. The towing cables broke free and the Doug's pod was sent skidding through the flaming wreckage of the engines, twisting and bumping violently along the desert floor to a smoking stop. Sebulba extracted himself in a shrieking fit, throwing pieces of his ruined pod in all directions, only to discover that his pants were on fire. Anakin Skywalker flew overhead, the exhausts from the big radon ulcers sending sand and grit into the Doug's face in a stinging spray. Hanging on to maintain control as he crossed the finish line, he became, at 9 years of age, the youngest winner ever of the Boonta Eve race.